decided you want to do genealogy, so how do you get started? This introductory program is going to be beginning a genealogy, getting started. So, what is genealogy? Genealogy is the field of research that studies the origins and descent of families. It identifies individuals and their family relationships, mother, father, aunt, uncle, cousin. It also places a family in its historical setting and reconstructs the lives of family members. And that's important, especially that second part, which I've highlighted, because a lot of people stop with the first one. They get a bunch of names and dates going back to 1850 and they say, well, I'm done. Or I've done my side, now I'm going to do my wife's side. Well, genealogy is a lot more than just collecting names and dates. If that's all you want to do, you can do that. But genealogy done well and done properly places those names and dates. You go back as far back as you can go in the records, and then you place those family names into their historical setting, and you try to reconstruct the lives of those family members as close as possible. In the last 20 or 30 years, academic historians have started using genealogy for the contribution it can make. Like, for example, biographers of George Washington will deep dive into his genealogical records, because historical records looks at the big picture, but studying families helps historians understand more of the small details of the big picture. And the illustrations are having to do with Thomas Marion Mountain Tom Clark, the Civil War guerrilla bushwhacker Union deserter who is allegedly buried under East Tennessee Street, and I use allegedly on purpose. Billy Sledge just said, tell history the way it happened. So, it's a great story, but that's a whole nother program, but I just don't think there's any way he historically can be there. The Lauderdale Times September 5th, 1872 account of the lynching the day it happened that was reprinted the next week says that Mayor Rice ordered to bury his body in an old field near our town. And I think that's exactly where they were, but that's a different program. And I'm researching a biography on Tom Clark, so I'm trying to sort the facts from the folklore. In the past, genealogy depended largely on oral tradition and undocumented materials, and its reputation was a little bit less than reputable. 75, 100 years ago, if you were a member of society, you could get in the DAR by saying, well, my great whatever served with General Washington at Valley Forge. Oh, well, Mrs. Cutler Smith would never lie about something as important as that, so we've got to let her in the DA. Well, it wasn't that easy even then, but in the recent decades, you really have to do your research and document what you're doing. So genealogy is a field of study based on the use and interpretation of documentary evidence. And you'll probably hear us all say a lot about the documentary evidence part. As important as the stories that you get from grandma or grandpa are, it's also important as much as possible to try to document those stories. You'll eventually get back to a point where it'll be really hard to find documents. For a lot of us, in my case with my Freemans, that's 1840. And I can't go any further back in documents than 1840. For some of us, for one of my other lines, I can go back to 1650 or 1655 around. For some of us, it'll be 1860, especially if you're African American. It may be really difficult to get back into slavery days, although in Lauderdale County, that's a little bit more easier than it is elsewhere. So some families will leave a paper trail and you can document as far back as you want to go. And some families you'll hit a brick wall, but it's very important to try to collect as much data and evidence as possible. So I have examples of that on the screen, and I also have brought some of that if anybody wants to look at any of this stuff. We'll talk a little bit more. You can pass that around if you'd like. I'll say a little bit about that in just a second. A good example of a work that's based primarily on oral history is the late Dr. Maurice Wade Pruitt's Booger Saga, which anybody familiar with that? if you're local and you were born and raised here, you probably know about Wade Pruitt's Booger Saga. It's a really great read, and I'm really glad that he wrote it. And he used some original sources, but not a lot. For one thing, his records got burned up in a house fire before he actually sat down to actually write the book. And he had to recreate the book largely from memory with the help of Ed Byler and some of the historical records that he could track down again. But it's mostly, this book is oral history. It's folklore. It's stories that his grandparents, aunts, and uncles told him. And that's important, but you have to make the distinction between oral history and what we can document with records. So it's still a great read, but it's important to try to differentiate between fact and folklore, if at all possible. Well, the basic methods you use when compiling a genealogy: you collect, interpret, analyze, and evaluate genealogical information. So the basic items of genealogical information are the dates and places of the events that establish these personal identities and family relationships, like the names, the dates, the date the marriages happened, the date the military enlistment happened, especially the dates and places that establish the relationships, the marriages, the deaths, the births, even the divorces, which Stephanie will talk about later. Those vital records are really important. What do I actually need to do to get started? How do you jump into this? A lot of people like to try to start in 1780 or 1650 or whatever year it might be, that they think they know an ancestor, and they go forward. But it's way better to work with the known, start with the known, and work towards the unknown. So to do that, you have to figure out what kind of materials and records are the best sources for the genealogical information that will be required to solve my problem. Then if I can't find the main records I'm looking for, are there alternative sources? Where are those records located? Can I get access to them? And then you want to make copies, and this is very important as well. Copy the materials or transcribe them word for word if you don't have a chance to copy them, or at least do an abstract where you summarize them. And then always make sure you cite your sources. You couldn't hand in a term paper for college or high school without citing your sources. And to do a good, accurate genealogy, you really can't do it without citing your sources, because someone else reading your research needs to know where you get your information from so they can help determine whether it's accurate or not. So you, 50 years later, can say, well, okay, what was I talking about when I said that? Oh, I've got a record. There's the source I got that from. So then you just interpret your evidence, you analyze it, and then you evaluate it. Is it good evidence? Is it trustworthy? In 6 and 7, you don't really have to do, if you're one of those really thorough, A, B, C, D kind of people, you can do those last two. But mainly, you want to collect your documents, your evidence, and think critically. And again, as I mentioned a minute ago, start with your parents and research backward a generation at a time. So if you start in 1780, it's looking for John Smith. There could be a gazillion John Smiths, and where do you even look for it? You may not even know. Well, I know I had a great-great-great-grandfather named John Smith, but I don't know where he was in 1780. And again, this is going to be kind of redundant by the end of the day, but always document your research. And if you look at probably 70-80% of the user family trees on Ancestry, they're very poorly documented. It's getting slightly better, but those family trees are not evidence for your descent from those families. You've got to do your own research and use them carefully. So always cite your sources and document your research. And again, great-great-grandpa was a Cherokee chief, and great-great-grandma was a Cherokee princess. If I've heard that one time, I've heard it 100 times in 25 years at the library. Probably more than that by now. That's true in some cases, although the Cherokee really didn't have chiefs and princesses. They had elders and not actual chiefs, but they kind of adopted that term because that's, non-Cherokee. You don't really know any better. So don't ignore them, but be a little bit skeptical. I mean, I had a lady yesterday. Yeah, the family that she was researching, or she got a book on her family from Green Hill, and Bill Hill in the book had said, or she had said that, oh, we're Cherokee, we got a great whatever that was Cherokee, full blood. And Bill Hill, he didn't know about that, so he couldn't write about it. And I'm thinking, in 25 years, I've only actually seen 2 people that could document their research for Native American genealogy through the Dawes rolls. So oral history is important, but not always accurate. I know in my own family, they didn't always tell us exactly how things happened on purpose. I found out I had 2 outlaws on my mother's side that allegedly rode with Tom Clark and his gang of bushwhackers, which I read about in Bill McDonald, and he was citing Booker Saga. So I asked my grandma Blair before she died, did you know French Hollis was an outlaw? Oh yeah, I knew that. I knew when I married into their family that he had done something as a young man and nobody liked him anymore. And I was like, why didn't you tell me? You knew me and Dad were researching the Hollises. And she goes, I didn't think you wanted to research the bad people. I'm like, we got to take them all. I'm sorry they did anything bad, but I just want to know what they did that was bad. So she told me everything that she knew. My mother rounded that out by pretty much confirming what my grandma had said. But they don't always tell you this stuff. If you do your family tree long enough, hard enough, right, if you shake it long enough and hard enough, rotten fruit's going to drop out somewhere. We've all got military deserters, illegitimate children, convicted felons. I've got 2 or 3. My dad has a cousin who, I'm not sure if he's still living, in Texas, who was banned from the state of Alaska for running confidence games. So we've all got them. So don't let that throw you off. Just, you got to take them as they come. But you just do want to research them. So I want to talk a little bit about good, better, and best evidence. So we have primary, secondary, and tertiary. So tertiary would be good evidence, secondary would be better evidence, and primary would be this is the best you can get. So primary evidence is the original document created at the time of the event by the parties involved. For example, the original marriage license filled out at the time of the marriage by the minister or JP, Justice of the Peace, who did the ceremony. Secondary evidence would be evidence that's not quite as good as primary evidence, but it's pretty good. For example, a marriage of the record of the marriage entered later into the marriage book. It might be 6 months or a year later that they actually entered this marriage into the marriage book. Well, that's still better than nothing, but it's not quite as good as primary. You know, or if you got a newspaper report of the marriage from the social page, that would be good evidence, but it's not quite as good as having that actual marriage license filled out by the minister right after he did or right before he did the ceremony. Tertiary evidence is a reference which you can use to locate secondary or primary evidence, such as an index of marriages in the courthouse. They have the marriage books in these big ledgers, and for the early marriages, there's one or two big binders of indexes for males and females, or index and reverse index from like 1820 to 1897. So that would be third hand or tertiary evidence, because it tells you if you want the marriage of John and Jane Doe, you got to go to Lauderdale County Marriages. Yeah, it'll make noises like that sometimes. We have not quite figured out why it does that. We just joke that it's haunted. So the index, those index volumes at the courthouse would lead you to the actual, volume A, page 506 of the marriage volume, where you can actually get the actual marriage record. Sources are items that you can touch, like a person, a document, a book, or an artifact. Then there's information, which is based on first-hand, primary, or second-hand knowledge, and this trips a lot of people up. Great-great-grandma was a Cherokee princess. Do you think that would be first-hand information or second-hand information? It might even be third, because you're not there. Your grandmother who told you this was not there. In a lot of cases, people will just say, look at that photo. You can tell she's Cherokee. You look at them high cheekbones and that nasal profile and that dark hair. Well, that really doesn't mean anything. Certainly not to a Native American. And evidence is information that's relevant to a particular research problem or question that will help you answer that question. I'm not going to say a lot about original versus derivative because this can get really technical. You know, if I was doing this for a group of lawyers, I probably would, but I'm not. So you want to get original sources as much as possible and not copies of sources. You want to get those original primary sources and not the third-hand sources as much as possible. Again, in some cases, all you can get are derivative sources, and you'll be really glad to get them. You just have to be careful to realize this is not as good as an original source, but sometimes it's the best you can do. So some examples of a source is this letter, and I think it's in that yellow binder or yellow folder that's being passed around.
Yeah, it is.
Letter to Mrs. Betty Gorman from December of 1879. You can touch that, you can read it. I think I've made copies of it. She was one of my ancestors who lived down in Culver County in Tuscumbia. So here's the marriage license of Henry G. Gorman and Virginia F. Pope, signed by A.W. Ligon, the probate judge. So what would this be? Yep, he signed it. He signed it. So if it's got his John Hancock on there, then, and I think that may be in there. I don't know if I put that in there or not because I was grabbing that on the fly. And then there's different types of evidence, like direct evidence that directly answers your question, and there's no need for any additional information. Got all I need to solve that one. Then there's indirect evidence, which is kind of like circumstantial evidence. If you think about it from a CSI or a prosecutorial standpoint, a legal standpoint, circumstantial evidence doesn't exactly answer your research question. For example, determining the year of birth for a person listed in the 1860 census. That sounds pretty simple, right? Just subtract their age from 1860. However, a 20-year-old person in 1860 could have been born in 1839, 1840, or 1841, depending on their actual date of birth, the date the census was supposed to be taken, and or the date the census taker actually showed up, or even how the respondent interpreted the census taker's questions. And they can do some really screwy things with censuses. Kitty will probably talk about some of that in a minute. So it's not quite as straightforward as just subtract 20 from 1860. So for a lot of my ancestors, the way the records appear to be, I just have made my peace with the fact that precise birth dates for a lot of these people I may never get. Precise death dates for some of these people I may never get. I can be fairly close, but for some of these people, it's not possible because of the way they were done. Collateral evidence is evidence contained in a record that really doesn't have anything to do with the purpose for which that record was created. For example, if a man writes his will and he happens to mention his wife's father as giving him a particular parcel of land that he mentions in his will, that he's willing to somebody, that would constitute direct evidence of the identity of the man's father-in-law because he wrote it and it's notarized. And if the will was the original, it would be primary evidence for that relationship because he wrote it, but it's not an actual deed record. So it's collateral evidence for that piece of property. Again, in some cases, that may be all you can find. You may not find a deed record because it never got filed. This may be the closest thing to it. But technically speaking, it's collateral evidence because it comes from a record that's designed for a different purpose. It just, by the way, happens to mention this piece of property if he had an especially nice relationship with his father-in-law. An example of indirect evidence, and this is an example I like to use, is my dad's great uncle Miles Freeman, who was married twice. His first wife was Dora Kershaw, and his second wife was Henrietta Hunt. And everybody, at least my dad, I think my granddad, knew that he was married twice, but we all just assumed the first wife had died. And so he remarried a few years later and had kids by both of these wives. But then one day in the old library building, back like in 1999, I'm going through the census microfilm, which tells you how long ago that was, because now everything's digitized, or a lot of stuff is digitized. So I'm going through the 1910 census. I think I was even going through it backwards just to make sure I didn't skip anybody that I was looking for. And I might not even have been looking for these Freemans. But I come to a page where I see if the pointer will work. Charlie and Ida Freeman living with a mother named Dora and a husband named John Mobley. I'm like, wait a minute. Miles Freeman's first wife was Dora, and they had 2 kids, Charlie and Ida. What are they doing with John Mobley? And it says, Dora and John have been married 5 years. She's the mother of 2 children, 2 still living. And I'm like, oh, I know what it is. She didn't die. They got divorced. Well, then one day I'm going through the Florence Herald, again on microfilm, and I find some correspondence, and they had these correspondents from different neighborhoods that would write in the news and gossip from their part of the county or the city of Florence. So I find the East Florence News written by someone who signed their name Goldenrod. That was their pen name. And they say at the end of their column, Miles Freeman has gone to parts unknown, leaving a wife and 2 children. And then I was pretty sure they had gotten a divorce. That pretty much confirmed what I had already suspected from the census record. Well, I was hoping I could find a little bit further corroboration of that. So I had, when we got the circuit court records from the courthouse that we're storing in our second floor in our digital archives department, that my colleague Colby is scanning to put on the library website eventually, I found the divorce decree from Lauderdale County Divorce Decree Book, Volume B, pages 105 to 108. And it really doesn't give me really good, concrete, solid answers. It's just like boilerplate. Some sort of abuse, like maybe he scolded her, or maybe she burned the toast and he didn't like it. It doesn't really give me really good reasons for why they separated, but it does confirm that they did in fact get a divorce. And I was later able to find, even before I found this, Donald Merckx found a non-residence notice for me where Miles had moved to Memphis and Dora was still living in Florence, and she basically advertised in the newspaper that if he had any claims on their estate from when they were married, he needs to come to Lauderdale and settle up their estate, or he forfeits. You know, if you want anything, you got to come back to Lauderdale. Otherwise, I get the house, I get the horse and bugboard. You know, I get all of this stuff, which I don't know if he did or not. But you see how we put all those different pieces of evidence together, collateral evidence, and it finally, when you get it, it's kind of like a preponderance of evidence, and you sort of string it all together, and now I see what happened. That's what you have to do in genealogy a lot of the time, is sort of connect those dots. Well, again, say you've done sort of some of that stuff, you've thought about it, how do you actually get started on the ground doing the research? Well, one place to start is to begin at home. Interview your parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. If they're comfortable, you can tape record it or film the interviews. You know, if they're willing and their minds are pretty clear and sharp, and they're comfortable with it. Sometimes they won't want to talk about it. Sometimes you need to let sleeping dogs lie and don't go there. And if they don't want to talk about it, that's cool. A guy called me from Seattle in the old building around 1999 or 2000, before we moved into this building 21 years ago, and he told me his name and that he was from Seattle, and he was researching the Gray family from Lauderdale County, and he needed some help because his grandmother refused to tell him why her grandfather was enumerated with his brother in the 1860 Lauderdale County jail. And so one of the local researchers and genealogists who used to be a member of the society, Pat Mahan, was there. Wait a minute, I remember those names. Check the Florence Gazette for like March of 1859. I think they were indicted for murder. And sure enough, those guys were indicted for murder, and they were being held in the Lauderdale County jail in 1860 when the census was done, awaiting their trial. And so since then, we were able to find the trial transcripts, the grand jury indictment, the Florence Gazette tracking their trial. They got a change of venue. They didn't think they'd get a fair trial in Lauderdale County, so they got it moved down to Franklin County, and the 2 guys eventually got acquitted. And one of them served with distinction in the Confederate Army as a captain. The other one was a doctor. But his grandmother was embarrassed by something that happened in 1859. That was a stain on the family honor, and she wouldn't talk to him about it. So he had to call us, and we were able to help him. So sometimes they won't talk about it. But again, if you shake your family tree hard enough, long enough, bad fruit will pop out somewhere. So look for records at home. We talked about that. But look at home. You may have more genealogical records buried at home in your attic or basement than you're aware of. Old family photos, family Bibles, yearbooks, letters, marriage licenses, deeds. If you've got an abstract for your property. Again, check with relatives. Maybe you've got cousins that are already researching it. And I have met families where each cousin there might be 5 cousins doing the research, but they're territorial. This cousin won't share research with that cousin who won't share research with those cousins. And our cousins on the Freemans, there are so few of us, we've all banded together because we figure the more heads working on a problem, the more likely we will be to solve it. So don't be hoarders. Some of these people collect all the references and documents and information and they hoard it. Or you got to jump through hoops to get it from them. If at all possible, to paraphrase Paul in Romans, as far as it lies with you, work at peace doing your genealogy with all of your relatives, which not always easy to do, but be prepared to uncover skeletons. We've already talked about that. Every family's got outlaws, illegitimate children, military deserters. Don't be embarrassed about something that happened in 1860 because you weren't there. This guy's grandmother, if she's still living, she's probably still embarrassed by that. Again, start with your parents and work backwards a generation at a time. It's probably easier to start with the father's line first because for most of the 20th century, certainly back into the 18th and 17th centuries, it was a patriarchal society. So most of the records that were generated or in the name of the male. In some cases, there will be records on women, but it's easier to research the males and then branch out. And then again, get copies of your records. I know you've heard me say this a bunch of times, but it's very important to try to get copies of your records. These are your genealogical proof. And if you're a member of a lineage society, and several of the board members are members of the DAR, the SAR, and other groups, they will want to see your documentation. Anybody can say, I've got a great whatever who was in the Revolutionary War or the War of 1812 or whatever, but it's different to be able to prove it. So they're going to want to see those documents. And Brian, weren't you at one time registrar for the SAR?
I'm still the assistant.
Okay, well, Brian can tell you all about how important it is to document your research to get into a lineage society. And then you'll use charts. The old way of doing it was to use pedigree charts and family tree sheets. So this is a pedigree or descendancy chart, which if I was doing this on myself, I would go here, my father would go here. For whatever reason, the way they design these charts, the males go at the top in the even numbered blanks, and the women go in the bottom half in the odd numbered charts. So you start with you in that first blank, and they're numbered, and they have spaces for birth, marriage, and death, and sometimes place of birth, place of marriage, and place of death. So and this is what one of those would look like doing it the old school way with pencil and paper. And you can see I don't have any of those, or very few of those actually filled out because I've got lots of blanks. But that's what one of those old, and this, Dr. Russell used to make us do these when he was a past president of the society. He passed away several years ago, and he would always make us fill these out by hand. Because when we were doing this back then, Family Tree Maker had just come out, Ancestry had just come out, so he made us use these old style charts. So this is a family group sheet. Family group sheet, as the name implies, it deals with single families. So if you had a husband who was married more than once and had children, or a wife that was married more than once and had children by each spouse, you do a separate sheet for each one of the spouses and the children. And so it's got dad's information, mom's information, then the children and their marriage and death information. So this is the bottom part where you can put the documentation. And this is what one of those would look like, partially filled out. Again, I got a lot of gaps in my Freemans. So this is one for my third great grandfather, Ison Freeman. This is pretty much, this sums up what I know about him and the kids that he had. But if you got Family Tree Maker or one of the other programs that are fairly inexpensive now, all you have to do is type in the names and data into the program and it will organize them. So I've got a few screens on here showing what some of Family Tree Maker screens look like. So this would be the home screen for Wiley Francis Freeman. And you can see the blanks to enter the information for all, the children, and it'll scroll down to do the children. And then if you want to look at the pedigree, you can do that. And with the newer Family Tree Maker programs, you can actually upload photos. So I've got photos added for the members of the family that I actually have photos for. And again, all you got to do is log into this and you can upload it. You can get very detailed. It's got so many ways to chronicle and document so many things on here. I mean, you can really do a deep dive into recording your family with these. And it'll print, it's got a place, pages on there for you to add personal sources, for you to add facts. So this is the personal sources for a man named Anthony Brandon, who was a formerly enslaved person who left his plantation and enlisted in Company H of the 111th United States Colored Troops from Lauderdale County. His Brandon family are having their family reunion over at Bailey Springs, St. Florian near Bailey Springs, even as we speak. Our cemetery preservation group helped them document their cemetery in 2018. So he's their Civil War progenitor, and a daughter of his from his third marriage, he outlived 3 of his wives. He died in 1929, and shortly after his death, his daughter got a Union military marker from the federal government that she put up in the Huff Cemetery in his honor, and it's still there, and it's in really good shape. So this is some research I did on Anthony for some of the Brandon family when we were working on their cemetery from Family Tree. And you can print these charts out. So I've got a couple of examples, pass these around, of what the Family Tree Maker sheets look like printed out. And these are just, I didn't do all the different versions that it will do because it does a lot of different things. But this is just some of what you can do. So what I like to do is have copies of my records online, or on my hard drive rather, digital copies, and then I like to have Family Tree Maker. I like to have everything in Family Tree Maker, and you can print out the material from Family Tree Maker and put that in with your plastic binders, which one good way to organize your documents is to print them out and put them in these plastic binders that you can get at Walmart or Office Depot or Dollar General or anywhere really cheaply, and the plastic sheet protectors. And that way you can have those and just flip through them whenever you need to look at them. Yes?
With this Family Tree Maker, I remember the last batch I had over Thursday a while back I was in. You said Family Search, people could kind of jive with your system.
Yeah, this is
personal.
Yeah, this is personal. Family Search is a website owned by the LDS Church, which I'll talk just briefly about in a second. And their family trees are crowdsourced.
Right, okay.
Anybody can add or take away from them, edit them basically. Ancestry, it's yours, unless you give somebody else permission to do anything to it. Their family trees are not crowdsourced. And Family Tree Maker, which you can upload your Family Tree Maker to Ancestry. I think you can still do that. And you control that. Nobody can tamper with that. There's good points about crowdsourcing, but there's bad points too, because it's like Michael Scott from The Office talking about Wikipedia. Wikipedia is like the best website ever because anybody anywhere in the world can write whatever they want about anything. And he would think that was great, but you can see where there's problems. So And problems do creep up on Family Search because it's crowdsourced. Yes, Carol?
I found a problem. One of them, I think it's Ancestry, in fact. I was tracing back on it a while back, and it came up with my mother's maiden name as McGehee. And I tried to correct it because it's actually McKee, and it wouldn't let me correct it.
Yeah. And that may be due to the vagaries of spelling, because census takers and county clerks are hooked on phonics.
Yeah, but this was from the 1940s.
Well, still, they can still mess stuff up. But yeah, that's the problem with it being crowdsourced. And sometimes it won't let you correct them. So, yes.
I know on Family Search, if you send a mistake, or if it's your, if you uploaded the information, you've got documentation to it, they can go in and change it, but you can contact, like with your information, you can contact Family Search
Yeah.
and tell them, nobody
Yeah.
can change this. But if you find a mistake over on the right, you can actually put in a comment, because
Yeah.
I had a multi-great-grandfather, and according to Family Search, his mother was born after he was.
Yeah.
And I said, somebody needs to fix this, because I don't think it's biologically possible.
Yeah, I'd like to see that one.
It disappeared.
Yep. And Stephanie makes a good point. There are steps you can take to fix it on Family Search. I don't have a Family Search account. Jordan does. He uses it much more than Ancestry. I've done mine with Ancestry. So there's good things about crowdsourcing, and there's stuff that's not so good, but there are workarounds. Brian?
And people are still misspelling stuff even today.
Oh, yeah.
Just limited to the 1940s and before.
I was looking at some of my handouts and I'm like, nope, shouldn't have done that. But too late to change it now because I printed them out. So I've got some examples of these binders that I use, and I've got to replace these because mine are getting kind of ratty and falling apart. So if anybody wants to come up and look at these, again, these cheap binders. And Dr. Darrell Russell, he would get really into these. He would do one binder of just Russell marriage records. Then he'd do one binder of just Russell vital or death records. One binder of Russell birth records. One binder of Russell obituaries. So I haven't got quite that specialized with mine because I don't have as many records as he had by that point. So you can do that. That's a lot more binders. But I like to have a digital copy saved on my hard drive. And Brian will tell you he's got all of his research backed up on his hard drive, and then several of his relatives have copies. So Brian's genealogy will survive the apocalypse because 15 or 20 people have copies of it, which is not a bad idea to make sure you have it farmed out in case something does happen. Always back up your hard drive and always have alternate copies. And the paper copies are good to take around to the family reunion. People can flip through them. We talked a little bit about Family Search. This is one of the good, there's a handout in your packet, in your folder, called Good Free Genealogy Websites. And we talked a little bit about Family Search. They're comparable to Ancestry. They got a lot of the same kinds of records, and they're free. I use them all the time. One good thing about Family Search is if you are in an LDS affiliate library or one of their family research centers, then you can actually download death records from Alabama through their site. And FLPL is an LDS affiliate library. So if you go upstairs, you can go to the health department and spend $15 a pop to get Alabama deaths between 1908 and 1974, or you can get them off Family Search. If you're not in a Family Search library or Family Search center, you can get the index page that says birth date, death date. It's where they summarize it. You can actually get the documents if you're in an LDS affiliate library. I think it has something to do with licensing agreements. Then here's a couple of more and I've got several of these websites. And since I'm here, I'm gonna give Patricia a few minutes to talk about the local Lauderdale County USG website if you want to, if you're ready.
Sure.
Since I'm at that point. She's the coordinator of the website that Pat Mahan used to do that is for Lauderdale County. She can talk a little bit about that. And then we're very near the end of session 1.
Yeah, and I won't take too much of your
Yeah.
time. Go
Can
ahead.
I ask a question?
Sure.
Before she starts? I'm not from this area. I'm from Walker County.
Uh-huh.
So if I was to search that website instead of putting Lauderdale County behind it,
Yeah, I think I've got the Walker County website in the handout.
okay,
But every county in the state, and every state or most of them have websites.
okay.
And their own, well, Patricia can talk about it. I won't steal her thunder.
No, that's, yeah, what he's saying is correct. The tricky thing about these Roots, so Roots Web is this network of different websites, and it is the US Gen Web. It's broken down into states, and then it's broken down into counties. And they have volunteers who run each of these sites. They were originally based, I don't know all the technical terms about all the databases and things, but they're all based on that Roots Web server. The reason, so the one that I did for Lauderdale County, it was originally on Roots Web, but when I took it over, I wanted it to be a little bit more modern, I guess, the site itself. And so I built it on a different platform. You can still go to the original, this web address.
I didn't realize I hadn't changed that out.
No, it's okay. But
That tells you how old this program is too.
yeah, but I actually gave it a new name. I just did Lauderdale AL Gen Web, GEN Web, so that it's the same content. It's still under that umbrella of these websites, but it's a different URL. It's going to be in a different server. So anyway, it is listed under there. Again, these are all run by volunteers. The beauty of these, though, and you should be able, even if you can't just change that to AL Walker or AL, any other county. Yeah. You should be able to Google it and find it. I still have a lot of people who still go to that old address, and that information is still there, but you can tell it's an old website. But the great thing about these Gen websites, the purpose of these, is really sharing that information. They say that only about 10% of records are actually online. You think that everything's online, right? I mean, you think you can type something in and you're going to find those records. It's actually not true. So these websites were created so that people could contribute their own family information, pictures or newspaper clippings or Bible records. Oh, we love finding those. So you're going to be able to find those kinds of things on the Gen websites. One of the other original purposes, AL
I can't remember it.
Gen Web. Lauderdale ALGENWEB. Yeah. Originally, when we all, like Lee and I are kind of up there with the genealogy. We're the same age, I think, so it's okay if I say we're both
No,
old.
you're fine.
But when we started, there really, you were doing all the research in the library and those kinds of things. You would actually write letters to other people. You would see a query, what they called a query. Like someone would come to the Lauderdale County library and write, I'm researching the Grays or the Simpsons or the, O'Neills. You would get their address and you would write to them and you could share information. These sites were a hub for that. People would include, put a query of, these are my families from Lauderdale County, these are who I'm researching and I'm looking for more information. So it was a collaborative kind of effort. But now, it's a huge site. There's so much information. And it is things, hopefully, these are things that you would not find on Family Search or on Ancestry.
Like photos,
Yes.
unidentified photos.
Yep.
Who am I? Where people have, that looks like my second cousin's grandfather.
Things that people have contributed to the site. So these queries, since we have social media and since we have email and things that, these are kind of archived, queries and surnames, but all of this information has been contributed either by a volunteer who has gone out, so for example, to a cemetery and done an actual inventory of the people in that cemetery. So
Like Orland Irons and Bill McDonald back in and maybe Bob Bentley helping them out in the 1990s or Bob Torbert, where they do the whole cemetery. Whereas Find a Grave is good, but they don't always do the whole cemetery.
I'm gonna throw in about Find a Grave. Volunteers do that as well, and
It's
sometimes
crowdsourced.
it is crowdsourced, and sometimes there's information that they have cobbled together that's not actually accurate. So go by what everything that Lee said.
I can tell you
Double
stories about
check. Double check everything. But a lot of this information on any of the gym websites, I actually like the older information because it's probably information you're not going to find anywhere else. So don't discount sites like this, even though you have Ancestry and Family Search and all these others.
Yeah,
So,
and that's a resource that
enough?
no, I think that's fine.
Okay.
So thanks for doing that.
No
I put you
problem.
on the spot. So I'm just wrapping it up.
And Lee,
Yes.
one thing to piggyback on that, we had someone mention about Walker County. If you're looking for a different county or even a different state, if you just go to the base USGen website, usgenweb.org, then you'll find a link on there for all of each state, all 50. From there, you go to the state website, you can find links to each of the
Yeah, and
counties.
Patricia's site should have links to the surrounding counties like Lawrence, Marion, Limestone. And I think I've put all the local ones in your handout. So yeah, you can get to those.
Yeah, but that'll help you, if you're in Tennessee or Mississippi, Kentucky, Georgia, the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, wherever.
Well, every state's got one, so wherever your primary ancestors are from, they probably got a website. And there are international websites too that are free like that, like Roots Web Ireland. I've posted queries on Roots Web Ireland 20 years ago or so.
And since they're all done by volunteers, some will have more information than others. Some may be, have posts as recent as today. Some may not be very active and may not have any posts in the last 20 years.
Yeah,
So
you
you
just
have to see what all you get. But
it's kind of like buying a car, buyer beware, well, user beware. Some of them are great and are really well documented, and with the Alabama Gen websites and the national sites, it depends on who does them a lot of times and how much time they had to spend on them. When Pat Mahan was doing ours, she lived here in Florence. She was retired. Her hobby was genealogy, so hers was really good. And Patricia has sort of carried that torch, and it's still a really good site. Most people do the best they can. They may host a site in a burned county where there aren't a lot of records. And so on the screen now is a page that focuses on 3 of the websites that the library has subscriptions to. You can buy a subscription to any or all of these, but we have subscriptions upstairs that you can log on to. And Heritage Quest is one that's owned by Ancestry. Anything that was distinctive about it that made it really useful, they kind of killed it when they synced it with Ancestry, but it's still free and you can use it through the library website. You just click on local history and then in the slider, click on Heritage Quest, type in your library barcode information and you can use it. And I have those in the handout as well. There's some books that no genealogist should be without, and we have these upstairs too, and I brought some of those downstairs. Val Greenwood's The Researcher's Guide to American Genealogy. These are kind of like genealogist Bibles. The Handbook for Genealogists, the Red Book, which is really good because it will tell you like Lauderdale County, Alabama, county seat, Florence, Alabama. It tells you the county seat for each county. It tells you when that particular state started keeping vital records, for example. This is really good to have. The source book tells you how to get organized and started doing genealogy, and it analyzes all of the research processes to do genealogy. Then there's the Map Guide to U.S. Federal Censuses, which goes up to 1920, which goes state by state, showing the boundary changes of every county of every state in America, which can come in handy, say, if you're researching for ancestors in Franklin County and you can't find them in 1850, it's because Colbert County didn't exist yet. It was created in 1867 out of the top half of Franklin. So people come in the library all the time, I'm looking for my great-great-grandfather in Colbert County, and I can't find him in the 1860 census. Like that's because the county didn't exist. So that'll help you keep track of that. And real quickly, there's that book, which we just saw.
Just leave it up there, the young man.
Okay. Well, I may put my census slideshow up there. You may want some of those in, unless Brian's got one for you.
That will be fine.
Well, we don't, Kitty will talk about that in a minute. It's in your handout. Basically, coats of arms trace back to individuals, not families. And not every family had or has a coat of arms. Heraldry developed in medieval Europe as a quick and easy way for noblemen, especially knights, in their armor to recognize each other on the battlefield. So they came up with these colorful, descriptive designs where you could recognize the Earl of Chester way over there on the field of battle. Coats of arms passed down from first sons to first sons to first sons in noble families. Sons would have to differentiate. I'm the second son, I'm the third son. So they trace back to individuals, not families. My freemans, probably that means they were free people and not serfs. That means we were not serfs or villeins. We were free people, but we were non-noble. There are several families of freemans that were granted the right to bear arms. Mine does not appear to be one of them. My Imes ancestors did have a coat of arms, which I had an example that somebody drew for me and I lost it, and I no longer have it. So I'm not going to talk a lot about coats of arms, but they go back to individuals, not families. You could have 3 individuals in the same family, 3 sons, and their coats of arms will be slightly different. You got the first son, the second son, the third son. You've got a brother. They all have different designs. And it gets really complicated and technical, so we won't go into a lot of the details about that. So I'm going to close out the first part of this